Okay, so topic 6.1 is about the features, the things that a classic design should have in order to be sort of considered classic, and the characteristics, the things that make something a classic design. And I put in your notes a few pictures of some classic designs for you to kind of think about as we go through this topic. And then the next part of your notes is a list of sort of the main things you need to make sure you have notes on and be able to apply, and a couple questions to consider. So there's an interesting international mindedness connection. We often say that classic designs are iconic. And iconic generally means they kind of represent something famous in a time or place. And what's interesting, though, is classic designs are often recognized across cultures. So, and they hold iconic status across cultures. And so it's interesting to think about like kind of how that happens, even though, they might be associated with a time and place in the USA, they're still iconic and considered classic in other countries. It's also interesting to think about the TOK connection is the reason classic designs often are classic because when we see them or use them, they appeal to our emotions. And it's interesting to think about whether it appeals to the same emotions in everybody, whether the emotions are the same across cultures, across sort of socioeconomic groups, across genders. Are emotions universal is an interesting sort of TOK question to consider when thinking about classic design. Okay, so one of my favorite definitions of classic design comes from this 3-volume set, the Phaidon Design Classics. This bottom one is on my desk in the classroom. Highly recommend having a look at it. It's full of really interesting examples of classic design, and they define it as an industrially manufactured object. So that's interesting. It is industrially manufactured, and part of the reason for that is because lots of them can be made, which means that they can be used by more people. Therefore, they have a better chance of becoming classic. They serve as a standard of their kind, and despite the year in which it was designed, is still up to date, and generally characterized by simplicity, balance, and purity of form, and has remained largely unchanged since its creation. So we'll unpack this more as we go through this topic. Okay, so we're going to start with an overview of the features of a classic design. These are the things that a product should have to be considered classic. So the first thing is they should be iconic. So the dictionary definition of iconic is relating to or characteristic of a famous person or thing that represents something of importance. So they could be iconic because they are related to a particular design movement. And I have put just a quick image here of a lot of the different design movements. In this course, you don't really need to know about a lot of these, any details about a lot of these design movements. But some of them, like Bauhaus, are worth sort of exploring, and Art Deco, and we'll see if we can explore a few of these as we go through the topic. They could also represent a period of time or a culture or subculture. So it could be kind of connected to anything like any one of those different sort of famous areas to make them iconic. To be a classic design, it also needs to be instantly recognizable. So as I mentioned before, being mass-produced means that that there can be a lot of them out there, and they can be really recognizable. People need to see them everywhere. They need to appear in media, and they need to sort of symbolize something, like I said before, a subculture, movement, or time period. The story behind how Coca-Cola came up with this very iconic, classic bottle design is actually really interesting, because they set out to make something instantly recognizable. The brief given to the bottle companies was to come up with a bottle design so distinct that you would recognize it by feel in the dark or lying broken on the ground. And the team that actually came up with this design actually took their inspiration from nature. So a good example of biomimicry. And they came across a picture of a cocoa bean, which had this sort of elongated shape with the ribs, and that was where they got their inspiration from. But you can see by this brief, Coke was looking for something instantly recognizable in their bottle. They were trying to make themselves iconic. A couple other features. So the design should be something that people want to own or use. So clearly it needs to be very functional. It needs to meet a need. And it also needs to have a strong emotion, like people need to want it. They have a strong emotional response to that particular design. But it needs to also transcend function. So it's not just about the function. There's something else about it. It needs to, like, it's a status symbol or it's collectible, and we'll talk more about that when we get to characteristics. Classic designs are sort of the standard for that particular design, and so they will often be widely imitated, often at a lower cost with sort of lower quality materials. But it's, if you know, everybody wants to have one of these, even if they can't afford it, so they're willing to buy sort of imitations. And also classic designs generally get more expensive the older they are, not less expensive. So they have a very high resale value. So those are features of classic design. Now there's also a list of characteristics that you need to know about. This is what a classic design should be able to do. So the first one is image. So they need to be instantly recognizable, and the image needs to provoke an emotional response. And the emotional response will actually influence the user's perception of the function and effectiveness of the design. For me, for example, I have a very emotional response to Volkswagen vans. And I'm willing to overlook all of the ways that they break down and the things that are wrong with them, but just because I really think they're cool. So that's that's what an emotional response would be. The Mini, for example, here, often will give people kind of like an emotional feeling of nostalgia when they see it. iPhones are also considered a design classic, and they might give you the feeling, all your friends have got one. So you now belong to the group of people who have iPhones or who communicate via FaceTime, or iPhones are generally more expensive. So, now you're with the group who have the expensive phones. So it sort of shows this emotion, the sense of belonging. A little bit of, for those of you in HL, it's worth kind of reviewing that emotional responses come in 3 different types. So you get your visceral, that's your first impression. It's like, boom, this makes me feel this way. Then there's a behavioral response, which is to do with the function. Okay, so it's like, this will allow me to do this, or usability. Oh my gosh, this is going to be so easy to use or hard to use. There's learnability. This is good. I'm going to learn how to use this so quickly, and it's going to be effective. It's going to allow me to do something. So behavioral is how the design performs. And then there's also reflective response, which is related to your self-image. So what does owning this particular product say about you? And we'll do this in class, but if you don't do it in class, it's worth having a look. Here's some Converse All-Stars. Take a minute, pause, reflect on what kind of visceral response do you get when you look at these? What kind of performance or behavioral response do you have? And what kind of reflective response do you have? So image is one of the characteristics of a classic design. A second characteristic is the classic design communicates something about status and culture. So owning a classic design can increase your status or indicate something about a culture you belong to. And it can increase your status by indicating membership in a subculture. That could be everything from, being a snobby connoisseur of something to being involved in an environmental movement or a pop culture. But ownership of a classic design can indicate membership to a subculture. It can also indicate wealth for a couple of different reasons. One is, it could just be like this 1959 Ferrari, which is worth $8 million. By owning it, you're saying I can afford it. Or you're saying I can afford to have an old car or something old where I have to put a lot of money into it to keep it going all the time. And finally, it can also increase status because of recognizability. It could be something that's part of pop culture. It comes from, it could be a lightsaber from Star Wars, or it could be something that appears in TV, films, etc., that you own, that's iconic, that gives you status and culture. So those are kind of three different ways that a classic design can indicate status. So the third characteristic is called obsolescence. So when something goes obsolete, it's no longer around. So classic designs, they transcend obsolescence. Okay, so generally, all products, and we talked about this when we did topic 5, will eventually have an end of life. So classic designs generally manage to transcend that obsolescence. Doesn't mean that they're still being made, but they generally will be made in small numbers, maybe not commercially viable, but because there's still collectors, there's still people who want them. Often the resale value of the existing products, because there's not very many of them, will be quite high. Also, as well as sort of more valuable classic designs, other kinds of designs will transcend obsolescence, not because they're worth much, but just because there are people who want them, right? So things like these Corgi toys, right? If somebody is an avid collector of them, then that's still worth something to them, and there still might be a market to make a few of them for these special collectors. Okay, so I've mentioned mass production a couple times. This is a very important aspect of classic design, because it's through mass production and distribution of a design that it will reach the greatest number of users and achieve the greatest amount of visibility in society. And so mass production goes hand in hand with economies of scale, which means that the product can be created for a lower possible cost, which means more people can own it, which means more people can become emotionally attached to it, which means that there's a larger chance that it will become a classic design. And so it's sort of a combination of all these different processes and materials involved in manufacturing that allow something to become classic. And we'll watch a video in the class about the Volkswagen Bug, and the reason for this very classic outline actually has to do with the fact that they're able to make it with less sheet metal, because you could actually just bend the sheet metal, whereas you'd normally have to use 2 pieces of sheet metal to make some of these parts if it was more boxy. This design allows them to use less sheet metal, which allows it to be made cheaper and therefore be affordable by more people. The Bialetti Mocha coffee pot is another example of a design that was engineered to be mass-produced, take advantage of economies of scale. So mass production, economies of scale, reduced costs, all very important in something becoming a classic design. So we'll watch this video in class. We'll watch about 2/3 of it. But if you don't see it in class, or if you want to see the whole thing, I'll leave this in the slides. Okay. Another characteristic of classic designs is that they should be ubiquitous. Ubiquitous is a fancy word for saying they're just everywhere, okay? They're constantly around you. You may not even notice them very much, but you would notice them if they were gone. So, you know, ballpoint pens like this is actually a classic design. And we don't even think about it anymore, but, you know, we've just gotten so used to having it around. The USB, this is maybe a little bit old now. This slide was made, but the Starbucks cup even, you know, these are just all around us, constantly present. And because they're around us all the time and constantly present, we start to attach emotions to them. And then the final sort of concept we should talk about in the context of a classic design. Not all classic designs will become dominant designs, but some classic designs will become dominant designs. And what a dominant design is, it's one that consumers, that is kind of optimized for consumers to like it. And so the classic example here, and we'll watch this video in class, is the iPhone. Before the iPhone came out, portable mobile phones had all kinds of different looks. And then the iPhone came out, and it was so perfectly what consumers wanted that all other phones and competitors to the iPhone that have come out basically copy the iPhone's form factor, because that's really what consumers want. And there are some examples out there of companies who have a classic design, a dominant design, and it's very, very risky for a company to then redesign that, because there's something about that original design that consumers have an emotional appeal attachment to that they might lose when it gets changed. A good example of this is BlackBerry. The people who used to love the BlackBerry phone, they loved having a physical keyboard. And after the iPhone came out and BlackBerry started to lose a lot of market share to the iPhone, they came out with a new BlackBerry without the keyboard, and it never really took off because they couldn't really compete with the iPhone, and they also lost their customers who were really committed to that physical keyboard.
All of these.
So I've put a couple of the videos in here that we'll watch in class if we have time, and if we don't, I'd recommend watching them on your own and just trying to see if you can identify what features and characteristics Doc Martens have. And then if you also for a little bit more information on iconic and classic design, this is a good 13-minute overview video as well.